Welcome everyone to the Institute for Public Knowledge. It's great to see so many people here. Usually we start 5 or 10 minutes late, but this crowd is raring to go. I can't remember another time when I walked into the room and the panel was at the table, ready. What's happening here, Kleinberg? Anyway, so I apologize for being a few minutes late, but that's just the way we roll. I'm Eric Kleinberg. I'm the director of the IPK, which is where you are right now. For those of you who are new to the IPK, we are a university-wide institute that does a whole range of programming about issues of our time that we think deserve a conversation, not just inside the academy, but between people in the academy and the many communities we're embedded in. We have workshops with faculty and students on issues like climate change and race in public space, AI, future of work, and the future of democracy, which makes us fairly unpopular in some quarters these days, but it certainly helps us generate timely programming. So tonight we are doing one of the things that we love to do here, which is to help launch conversations about important new books. And I'm going to borrow this as a prop. You may have an image of it for you. We're really lucky to be gathered here tonight to talk about this thing that we're all experiencing, I think, very profoundly in our own lives, which is American Contradiction. It's the title of Paul Starr's book, Revolution and Revenge, from the 1950s to now. Paul, as many of you know, is one of the major thinkers in the social sciences. He is a professor at Princeton, author of major prize-winning books on the U.S. healthcare system, media, social policy, and he's got an amazing synthetic mind, which you really see at work in this book. It starts with this question that I know has puzzled everyone in this room. How is it that a country could elect someone like Barack Obama as president, and then just 4 years later elect someone like Donald Trump as president? How do we make sense of the fact that this is a country whose people have changed dramatically, whose culture has changed dramatically? It's very different on a whole host of social issues in terms of public opinion, that's seen upheaval in our social hierarchies, and yet in that same time, it's a country that's been politically sclerotic. And there's this kind of disjuncture between social change and stasis in our political institutions that's led us to this situation, but also obviously kind of revolution in our political system now, which means that now everything is up for grabs. And Paul's book is just a deeper probing work of scholarship on this topic. It's a book celebration because the book is just published like this week. 2 weeks ago, just published, but because we're masochistic here in the Academy, the way we like to celebrate new books is by bringing really smart people to tell us all what's wrong with them. So we have 2 people who are very able to do that, but I think that is not exactly how the conversation will go. But first, after Paul talks about his book, is my colleague here at NYU Sociology, Maria Abascal. She's really one of the great emerging thinkers on the problems of race, ethnicity, identity, social boundaries, social cohesion. She's kind of joy to work with and to think through these issues with. We have a fascinating new project that we'll talk about tonight about Latinos who have become Trump voters. And I've asked Maria to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes after Paul, and then another colleague of mine from the urban studies world at NYU, historian and professor of social analysis, Sugrue, who's written about a famous book about the history of Detroit and also a major book on the history of U.S. civil rights. Tom is going to do the same, talk for about 5 or 10 minutes. Then we will see if Paul wants to engage. We'll open it up for conversation. And most importantly, when all this is over, we're going to join Paul over by the booksellers table and do our duty of making sure that the booksellers don't have to leave here with any books to carry. I know Paul will be happy to sign it. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and please help me welcome him back.
wonderful to be in front of a live audience. I see familiar faces. I've been doing, like authors of new books do these days, I've been doing a lot of podcasts. One never knows, does anybody actually watch these? I used to do, in books in the past, I used to do a lot of call-in radio. Often when I was writing books about healthcare, and people would call in and say, Dr. Starr, do you have any recommendations for back pain? And, but now the podcast, people ask me, what are my recommendations to solve all the problems in American society? And I don't have a better answer than I did, on the issue of back pain. If I had been RFK Jr. back in those days, I would have at least said, don't take Tylenol. Okay. So, as Eric indicated, American Contradiction is one central motivating question, and that is, how did Americans come to elect Barack Obama and then elect Donald Trump? That's the American Contradiction in a nutshell, in our time.
Mike, how do you either be there or not?
Do I really need to use the mic? Is that really? I do? Okay. I used to be able to project for a room this size, but maybe age has taken its toll. So according to an old image, America is a city on the hill. Perhaps a more telling image, more accurate image, is of America as a city built on a geological fault, which has often shaken us and occasionally produced earthquakes, and the latest of those is threatening to reduce our republic to rubble. Future historians are going to wrestle with the Obama-Trump conundrum, and they'll probably have different explanations from mine about what has produced this. Election analysts have already broken down the votes when Obama won in 2008 and 2012, and when Trump won in 2016 and 2024. But as revealing as those are, and I make use of that voting data, the immediate causes of each race, how they turned out, can't really provide us with a full story of our time. They don't really tell us how it was in the first place that Obama and Trump became plausible presidential candidates. Before Obama was elected, sober opinion held that no black man could be president. And before Donald Trump won, sober opinion held that Americans would never put somebody like him in the White House, much less have him knock down part of the White House wall. But these impossibilities happen. And many of us, and I include myself here, missed something about America in thinking that these things could not happen. So I've tried to explain in this book the long-term changes on both sides of the American divide that produced not just Obama and Trump in succession, but, as the book's subtitle says, revolution and revenge from the 1950s to now. This contradiction, the American contradiction, predates the 1950s. It originated with America's founding contradiction, the contradiction between freedom and racial slavery. But it can be more generally understood as a contradiction between freedom and social subordination. Now, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying that freedom was a myth and social subordination was the reality. These were both American realities, though to different extents, for different people. And nor do I mean that the relation between freedom on the one hand and enslavement and subordination on the other has merely been a paradox, as so many have said. The elements in paradox are opposed only superficially. Once we grasp a paradox, we see that the elements fit together and make sense. In a contradiction, the elements negate each other, and there can be no genuine resolution except through change. Unlike a paradox, a dilemma, or mere hypocrisy, a social contradiction is a source of conflict at a deep level over first principles, as slavery was. Some may shy away from the word contradiction because of its association with discredited Marxist and Hegelian ideas of historical necessity. But contradiction is a fine word, and it is an honest and true word for the historical situation of black people in the United States. The legacies of the founding contradiction have never been entirely overlooked. And it was in the struggle against those legacies of white supremacy, it was those struggles that set off the latest phase of the contradiction in American history. But the conflicts ignited by black people went far beyond their own. Black Americans became a model minority. A model not only for other racial minorities who had been denied equal rights and respect, but also for the women's movement and for what was originally the gay rights movement. The black struggle provided a model in specific ways. It provided a model of what sociologist Charles Tilly calls repertoires of contention, how battles are waged. It provided a model for other movements, legal and cultural and economic claims. It was black protest that led to the civil rights legislation and key judicial precedents. But that legislation and the worker movements also barred other forms of discrimination, including discrimination on account of sex. Indeed, the struggle for gender equality became just as important as the struggle for racial equality. That's an ongoing theme through the book. The progressive currents in liberalism called into question all the traditional hierarchies in American life. White over black, men over women, straight over queer, the traditionally religious over the secular and the non-traditionally religious. The civil rights movement also indirectly contributed to the passage of the 1965 immigration legislation that eliminated the national origins quotas dating from the 1920s and opened the U.S. to non-European immigration. Now, it should be no surprise that these changes provoked a backlash. And not just a backlash, a disruption of a more fundamental kind. Americans are both a people and a nation. Two things that may seem the same. But since the middle of the last century, the American people have evolved more than the nation. The changes in the American people have come from new understandings of identity and rights, infusions of new immigrants, and younger generations, especially of women, prepared to live in a different world from that of their parents. As a nation, though, the United States is still moored to an old version of itself. It has an 18th century constitution that among those of all the major democracies was the hardest to amend, with a Senate and electoral college that underrepresent urban populations. The Supreme Court holds the power to interpret that almost unamendable constitution, a power that it used in the mid-20th century to advance revolutionary changes in rights, race, and gender. But today, in the name of history and tradition, the original meaning of the Constitution, the court insists on a return of the law to a time before women, black people, and other minorities had any say. This is the new form of the rift in American life, the contradiction between a changing people and a resisting nation, a nation with entrenched institutions that have empowered those who fear the changes and look to restore an old America of their imagining. For all their flaws, the nation's institutions and symbols have historically proved adaptive. They haven't served all Americans equally well, but they have enabled the country to grow, prosper, and come closer to fulfilling the Constitution's promise of a more perfect Whether the nation can do that in the 21st century is no short thing. Its institutions may now be too skewed in favor of an older America that cannot accept the new America its people are becoming. Some welcome the new America, but others are afraid of it. Movements for progressive change have opened new life possibilities for millions who would otherwise not enjoy the freedom in personal relationships, families, and careers they have now. But economic inequalities are greater than they used to be, and many people who once had a secure footing in industrial America have lost it in a post-industrial economy that has devalued their skills. They identify the old America with a normal and a good life, and see the forces changing the American people as a dire threat. For them, the promise of a return to America as it once was, or as they imagined it, is a source of hope. I'm not sure how much longer I should be on. Should I go another 10 minutes? Okay. All right. I don't. I'm looking forward to the conversation, but I do have a bit that I wanted to talk about. I begin American Contradiction with 1950s America because it continues to serve as a benchmark for measuring how much America has changed, either for the worse or for the better. The 1950s were both stifling and admirable. Stifling for people who rejected dominant consensus culture and consensus politics, but also admirable. Incomes were more equally distributed than they are today. In fact, working people's incomes grew faster than the incomes of the rich, partly because America had the highest rate of unionization and the highest tax rates on the rich that it has ever had. The 1950s were also a child-oriented decade. We built a lot of schools, whereas later we built a lot of prisons. So both conservatives and liberals, for different reasons, look back on that era as a benchmark. But when a recent survey asked whether America's culture and way of life have changed for the better or the worse since the 1950s, 2/3 of Republicans said for the worse, and 2/3 of Democrats said for the better. And that's really no surprise. When Trump calls to make America great again, most of his supporters, I think, are remembering an idealized before time in the 1950s, before black insurgency, before feminism, before Vietnam, before the loss of working class jobs with middle class incomes. Now, if there were a left wing Make America Great Again, it would mean bringing back those strong unions and high tax rates on the rich. But we can be sure that's not what Trump and his followers are talking about. American Contradiction divides our recent history into two phases. The first phase runs from the 50s to 1990 and revolves around that revolution in rights, race, and gender, and the conservative backlash against those changes. That half of the book ends with a chapter called Half a Counter-Revolution that focused on the social and political changes from Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, that whole period of history. I call it only half a counter-revolution because even Reagan didn't reverse the momentum of racial and cultural change. But he cut taxes on the rich, accelerated the decline in unions, and contributed to rising economic inequality. We've had, ever since then, this paradoxical, we don't use the term paradoxical, this paradoxical combination of a commitment to growing social equality, at the same time as we have rising economic inequality. Why wasn't Reaganism the full counter-revolution that Trump is undertaking? Younger generations may not appreciate one fact. Until the mid-1960s, the Republican Party was actually the more liberal party on civil rights, on racial issues, and gender issues. And as late as the 1980s, many Republicans, including members of Congress, high administration official, and of particular importance, Republican appointees to the Supreme Court, other courts, those still retain elements of that earlier heritage, which held the party back from a full-scale reaction. They also, those Republicans of that era, also worked often constructively on compromises with Democrats, and they upheld constitutional norms. As I see it, the historical pivot was the 1990s, a decade when we might have had an era of good feeling with the end of the Cold War, but instead went from Cold War to culture. The new domestic war did not erupt just because Democrats and Republicans became more ideologically polarized, the usual story that political analysts tell. Republicans broke with their own past. Newt Gingrich was a key figure in leading Republicans to put aside bipartisan civility and treat Democrats as enemies, traitors, and sick degenerates. There's this memo that he issued to other Republicans about how to talk about Democrats, and it uses just these kinds of terms. New conservative media with a national audience, Rush Limbaugh, the radio, Fox News, both those began during the 90s, relentlessly attacked Democrats and liberals in similar terms. Polarization was strategic. It had a political logic for Republicans. Like the Cold War, the Culture War gave their party an urgent moral purpose as defenders of the American way. But why has this second phase of recent history, since the 1990s, been so different from the first phase, from the 50s through the 80s? And I put the differences under two headings: fear and aggression. From the 1990s to our time, racial and cultural change have created a sense of rising opportunity on the left and rising danger on the right. Liberals become righteously overconfident, while conservatives became obsessed with impending political catastrophe. America's changing demography affected both sides of the political divide. Until the late 20th century, the United States was a 90-10 society, in the sense that Americans thought of the country's racial landscape as 90% white, 10% black. Even whites who were agitated by the civil rights and black power movements knew that blacks were not going to be able to take over nationally. Immigration, however, turned America into more of a 50-50 society, just as it also became a 50-50 country politically. The two major parties closely matched in support, in electoral support. Based on new U.S. Census projections in the 1990s, many analysts began proclaiming a future when whites would become a minority. And the inference that many people drew was that America was approaching a tipping point, when politics would shift decisively to the left powered by growing numbers of people of color. Barack Obama's election seemed to validate those expectations, and I think had a very considerable effect on the sense of danger on the right. Now, the demographic forecasts, I argue, were misleading. I'm not going to go into that right now. But the fiction of an imminent reversal of the position of whites became a political fact of the first importance. At a time when other cultural developments increased conservative anxieties. The share of Americans self-identifying as Christian was falling, down from 90% in 1972 to 64% in 2020, while the proportion of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, that is the proportion of people who are identified with no religion, had risen from 5% to 30%. rising percentages of young people also identified as LGBTQ. Young women were surpassing young men in education and employment. Progressives mostly celebrated these changes and pressed for reckonings and reparations, unaware that they were sleepwalking into revenge. Conservatives saw the same development as signs of national decline. They feared that snowballing racial and cultural changes in the American people would permanently cost them control of the nation. By the early 2000s, the conservative story about democratic responsibility for national decline had resonance among many working class whites for another reason. It seemed to explain the loss of economic security they were experiencing. Year two, Democrats went sleepwalking into revenge by supporting the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994 and the opening to China later in the decade. And partly as a result of both demographic and economic change, the makeup of the two parties has shifted over the past 30 years as non-college whites since the 1990s moved to the Republicans, while college-educated whites have moved to the Democrats. I'll just put that on. You don't. That influx changed who Republicans were, creating an opening for right-wing populist appeals and the overthrow of the old Republican leadership by an insurgency within that party that just happened to be led by Donald Trump, might well have been led by somebody else. Trump completed the transformation of the Republican Party that Gingrich began. Gingrich and Trump have modeled a different way of doing politics, relentlessly aggressive, uninterested in compromise, indifferent to democratic norms, openly hostile to enemies, contemptuous of the opposition. And that is how we have gotten to the point where there is a real chance of breakdown of democracy in the United States. Trumpism is, I suggest in this book, the politics of total revenge. Not only his personal revenge against his individual enemies, but retribution on behalf of a fearful Republican base for all the changes that the progressive currents in liberalism have brought. So this book does not end with prescription. It does not have a solution. But here's what I say in the book's final sentences. If Americans are to do in the 21st century what they did in the 20th, if they are to live in a democracy with any hope of liberty and justice for all, if they are to establish a more perfect union, they will have to create new popular movements and new institutions capable of repairing the damage from Trumpism and from the shocks that unquestionably lie ahead. It's not too early to start thinking about what form those movements and institutions should take. Now, actually, I don't have a prescription, as I said, about what those movements and institutions should be. But I do want at least you to take one positive thing from this history, as grim as it may seem. This country is capable of surprise. The better angels of our nature are forever fighting the dark forces within us. At other dangerous moments in the past, the future looked as grim as it does now, yet we found new leaders and recovered. And that history ought to give us confidence in a new American surprise, a rebirth of decency and democracy, but we'll have to work for that.
Inviting me to be on this panel and for putting the panel together. I want to let all of you know that Paul taught a required course that I took in my first year as a PhD student in sociology at Princeton. And so it's doubly an honor to be on this book panel because I feel like I'm still very much learning from Paul. So I'm going to start out with some comments summarizing my own reading of American Contradiction, and then I'll end with some comments and questions for Paul. So most immediately, the contradiction that the book deals with that gave rise to Trump and the Roberts Court is, as Paul said, the rise in economic inequality, inequalities between labor and capital, between Americans with college degrees and those without, coinciding with the rise of social equality due to civil rights victories among racial minorities, first Black Americans, then women, and LGBTQ Americans, paired with the growth of immigration in the latter half of the 20th century. Beginning in the 1960s, and in part as a result of these changes, there was a growing breach in progressive politics between two constituencies that were served by the kind of liberal wing of American politics, between unions on the one hand and between Black, feminist, LGBTQ, anti-war, and environmental movements on the other. Democrats, Paul notes, started to turn away from unions as early as the 1960s, he writes, in all the years after World War II when Democrats held congressional majorities. They failed to pass a single bill that aided private sector organizing. While this is happening, Republicans were pursuing a series of moves to win new constituencies, including Southern whites and evangelicals, by turning first on Black Americans, then on women and LGBTQ Americans, and then finally on immigrants in immigration. In Paul's account, moderates in both parties, he writes, sleepwalked into a new political era. And the turning point, as he told us, came not exactly in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, or even in 2015 when he came down the famous golden escalator, but in the 1990s when Republican leadership, and he mentioned the example of Newt Gingrich, set a new low for partisan discourse and gave up on writing laws that could reflect well on the majority party. Paul refers to the era since the 1990s as a 50-50 era, meaning in part that it was an era characterized by two sharply divided parties that were closely matched in electoral outcomes, largely because of institutional relics of American government. Democrats, he notes, won the popular vote in 7 out of 9 presidential elections from 1992 to 2024. But of course, as we know, the Electoral College gained victory to the Republican candidate in 2016. Democrats also, and I didn't know this, won a majority of votes cast in Senate elections from 1986 to 2020, but Republicans held the majority in the Senate, being half of those elections, because of course Republicans do better in small states. So this is the other contradiction, one of the others that Paul points out at the heart of American politics, which is on the one hand America's idealization as a democracy paired with antiquated, hard-to-change institutions, including an electoral college and an upper house of Congress. Without these institutional constraints, the Republican Party would have faced electoral defeats that would have pushed them to moderate their positions to appeal to the center, but instead, to paraphrase Paul, they have been able to move further right at no electoral cost. For their part, Democrats were lulled into complacency by the promise of a coming majority-minority America where non-Hispanic whites would make up fewer than 50% of the population. The RNC report after Obama's 2012 re-election, known popularly as the RNC autopsy, voiced Republicans' fear that was simultaneously every Democrat's hope that the country's demographic destiny would usher in long-term electoral dominance for Democrats. The darkest version of this theory is known as great replacement theory or white replacement theory. It argues that demographic change is a deliberate plot by American liberals to replace the white demographic and cultural core of America. And the theory, for those who aren't familiar, has been linked to multiple mass shootings and also given airtime by right-wing commentators like Tucker Carlson. You see, I think, especially following the 2024 election, where those hopes of demographic dominance or democratic dominance through demographic change have ultimately led. I want to raise a few points for discussion, not all of them questions. I think they all touch of this demographic destiny narrative. Full disclosure, that's what I work on. For those who aren't familiar, a lot of my research looks at how white Americans respond to the Census Bureau's projections of a looming majority-minority America. Projections that really took off in the 2000s, arguably, though they were kind of already in the works in the 1990s. And in ongoing research, which Eric mentioned, I've been interviewing U.S. Latinos on who they supported in the 2024 election. So first, I want to offer a small correction to the reading of demographic forecasts as misleading, right? And here, I get this as you're drawing, especially on work by the late Richard Alba, a sociologist whose book, The Great Demographic Illusion, deals precisely with the Census Bureau's forecasts following the early 2000s. So in line with Richard's book, you interpret demographic change as, or at least these demographic forecasts, as an illusion as much as a reality, right? The problem that you and Alba identify has to do with the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of who counts as white, right? So the U.S. Census Bureau defines people who identify as non-Hispanic white alone as members of the dwindling white majority, right? You point out, and correctly, that this ignores people who may otherwise be seen or even see themselves as white, but who also either identify or are classified by the Census Bureau's projection or algorithms as multiracial. For example, this would include people who identified as white and American Indian following the change in 2000 where the Census Bureau allowed people to check off more than one race on their census form. Or it would include people who in the 2020 census, and this is something you've written about, identified themselves as white but wrote their origins as Argentinian. The U.S. Census Bureau's algorithm would have you reclassified in that case as multiracial. So it does exclude those people, but by far the largest group of people who identify as white but don't fall in this non-Hispanic white category of that we think of as the dwindling majority are Americans who identify as Hispanic and white, right? So here, I think Alba makes an assumption that you carry over into your analysis, which is that many Hispanics do have white European ancestry and mix easily with Americans whose ancestors came directly from Europe without a stopover in Havana, Buenos Aires, Caracas, or Mexico City. Arguably, though, what matters is not whether people have some percentage of European ancestry, but how they are seen by other Americans and how they are treated by other Americans. And as it turns out, and forgive me for getting into the weeds of my own research on Latino racial classification, as it turns out, if you compare Latinos who identify as white to those who identify with some other race category, which is the other largest racial category with which Latinos identify, they are on average indistinguishable in terms of skin color and in terms of how they think they are seen by other people walking down the street. They are not, in other words, Latinos who identify as white, they are not phenotypically white in the same way that non-Hispanic whites are phenotypically white. And the share of Latin Americans who have exclusively European ancestry, whose ancestors made the stop over in Latin America and didn't marry anyone else, is probably very small. Right? So the point is this, you are right, U.S. Census Bureau projections have all sorts of artifacts and how to define race, etc. But the decision to treat non-Hispanic whites as the quote-unquote real whites, whose numbers are declining, is not totally arbitrary or indefensible. It matches many Latino Americans' own lived experiences of how they are racialized and treated, as well as, I think, a broader social definition of race and whiteness that excludes most Hispanics, even if they themselves would identify as white on a census form. So my second set of comments has to do with the two reactions that you write about following Obama's re-election in 2012. So following his re-election, there was, on the one hand, the establishment view, the RNC report, the so-called autopsy that I mentioned, that argued that Republicans should embrace comprehensive immigration reform in order to win over Hispanic voters and immigrant voters. The minority view, which I I was not familiar with until I read your book came from political analyst for your politics, Sean Trent, who saw a totally different path to victory that ran through lower class rural white voters. And here I'm going to quote you quoting Trent. You wrote, "This GOP would have to be more America first on trade, immigration, and foreign policy, less pro-Wall Street, more Main Street populist on economics." So I have two questions, one of which you answered, I think, more clearly in your comments than in the book, which is, how did Trent's view win out? Is there something special about Donald Trump? In your comments you said, this really might have been led by anyone else, right? Or was Donald Trump, as your comment suggested, just in the right place at the right time? It is clear in your book that you don't think Trump is an anomaly in the long scheme of American history. You write, Trump would be an aberration of the Civil Rights Revolution and finally put America's ideals on a irrevocable foundation. And my question has to do with American analysts' tendency, I think, to treat Trump as a singular, charismatic individual. But of course, we've seen this shift toward right-wing populism taking place beyond the United States, in Europe, in Latin America. What, if anything, is special about Trump? And relatedly, what, if anything, is special about the United States? How much do specific features in American government, institutions really matter? How about the decline in unions? I ask in part because even countries in Scandinavia with high rates of union coverage to this day, or countries like Italy and France, where most workers are covered by collective bargaining agreements, have seen growing momentum behind populist movements. And then finally, I'm going to ask a totally self-serving question related to my own research, because I don't often get Paul Starr in the room. So what's your working theory for why a larger share of immigrants and Latinos voted for Trump in 2024 than 2020 and even 2016? Although, of course, we know Trump's hostile rhetoric and policies kind of cemented this definitive shift away from immigration in the Republican Party. So why, in other words, were both the RNC autopsy and Sean Trent wrong? Embracing comprehensive immigration reform is not the only viable path to victory, but neither did the only alternative run solely through rural white voters, but instead created a growing multiracial coalition.
Thank you so much, Eric, for inviting me here, and especially for the opportunity to read such a marvelous book. I'm going to be wearing my hat as a historian, although I'm a fellow traveler and sociologist, for sure. But I want to talk about this book as a history, but I want to begin by offering a historian's praise to a historically friendly sociologist. This is, in my opinion, the best synthetic overview of American politics and society from the mid-20th century to the present. It's really good. In other words, buy this book when you leave. You're going to learn a lot from it. I marveled. Yes, I will. I'm expecting a little cash, Tom Homan style. It'll be in a big brown bag as I walk out of the room. But it really is a marvelous synthetic pulling together of a lot of what many of us in history and in sociology have been working on for a long time, and it's really hard to pull off. I think the only book that I can think of that had such ambition and pulled it off was a book that Paul cites. He pulls a great book from it. Actually, at one point in the book is Godfrey Hodgson's American Out of Time, published in the mid-1970s. It was a British journalist slash historian's reflection on the United States since the New Deal up to the mid-1970s. Hodgson was more impressionistic. Paul is a sociologist, not a historian journalist, and so I think actually the book has a lot more meat behind it, but it has the same synthetic ambition and really pulls together a lot of things that no one has quite pulled together before. So I want to talk about a few of those things that Paul does in this book, pulling things together, and then ask some questions. first, this is a book that breaks from the vast majority of overviews of recent American history that was the 1960s. Right? We dispatched with the 1960s in about 90 pages. It's not that the 1960s isn't important. It is, particularly in Paul's discussion of the African-American freedom struggle and the sexual and gender liberation movements of the 1960s, which are crucial to laying the groundwork for the social movements and the cultural debates that follow. But many books begin and end with the 1960s. They really begin sometime, usually around the New Deal, and end around 1968, and don't think further. Paul decenters the 1960s in ways that I think are really generative for thinking about America in our time. So I want to point out a few ways that he does that. One is he challenges the conventional wisdom that still prevails in journalistic circles and broader accounts of modern American history, which is the 1960s marked the unraveling of liberalism, the end of the so-called New Deal order, a moment of critical realignment, or as Jefferson Cowie and Nick Salvatore have argued in a recent influential book, the end of the great exception in American political history. It begins around the time of the election of Franklin Roosevelt and ends sometime around 1968 or maybe in the early 1970s with the rise of neoliberalism and the global fuel crisis. This is a book that recenters, as Paul said in his introductory comments, around the 1990s. While at first I was not expecting to be persuaded by his argument about the centrality of the 1990s, I lived through that period, as almost everyone in this room did. I'm really persuaded of it in many key ways, but I want to amplify maybe some arguments he makes as well. The next major point that I want to make is that Paul offers a more sophisticated history of the rise of the right and the role of the new right in American politics between Nixon and the early 21st century. And this is a really important contribution. There's been a near library of books and articles published by historians over the last 25 years or so on the new right. A lot of really good books, but many of them still see the right as triumphant with the rise of Richard Nixon, and then just make an argument that essentially everything that happens in the aftermath is a form of right-wing consolidation. Or they describe the right solely or as primarily as a manifestation of backlash politics to the civil rights movement. Both have elements of truth to them, but Paul offers a bigger twist to the story that I think is a really important one, which is that the realignment of national politics, if we want to use that outdated term, the realignment of national politics that began with Richard Nixon was very, very incomplete, or the half counter-revolution that he describes. Nixon, after all, known for his rhetorical rightward shift in an effort to win the Goldwater wing and Southern Democrats disaffected the civil rights movement to the party, his silent majority rhetoric and his attacks on various war and poverty and Great Society programs, and especially the social movements in the 1960s, belied the fact that he worked with congressional liberals. The country was still overwhelmingly liberal, and Nixon was the architect of domestic policies that included solidifying affirmative action, implementing environmental regulations that would quickly be despised by the right, and so much more. Turns to Reagan, as he mentioned as well, and despite Reagan's revolutionary rhetoric, the Reagan Revolution, many of the pillars of liberal social policy and racial policy and civil rights policy remain intact. And so, as we think about the 1980s, then we can't look at it teleologically as the inexorable rise and triumph of the right, when there was still an enormous amount of contestation going on in American politics, and a gap between the rhetoric and the reality of the social policies that were in place that were, in many respects, ratifying the changes that were available on the ground. I want to point out just one quick example that draws from my own work, since I think it's worthy of reflection on a little bit more, and that's the politics of affirmative I wrote a little article and wrote at length about the struggle for rights in the workplace for African American workers in the 1960s and the 1970s. One critical moment that I write about is Executive Order 10,925. This is the Johnson administration executive order that essentially puts into place what would become affirmative action later on, that requires employers with government contracts to set aside places for underrepresented workers. Executive Order 10,925 survives Nixon. It survives Reagan. It survives Bush 1. It survives Clinton. It survives Bush 2. It survives Obama, and even survives Trump 1. However, Trump 2 wiped it out in his second day of his presidency in his second term. We have to understand, in other words, the ways in which policies that were enacted in the heyday of liberalism weren't simply stomped out in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. The right-wing triumph, in other words, is a much more contingent one, and Paul makes that story clear. Paul also gives us a new take on liberalism in the 1990s, and I want to pull a quote from here that I really took my fancy because I remember this moment very vividly. He talks about how he, Robert Putner, and Robert Reich launched the new magazine that we called the American Prospect. The cover of the first issue showed an egg breaking open to reveal a new world inside, a world reborn. But the promise of that new world would not be fulfilled over the next 3 decades. Politics in the 1990s took a particularly ugly turn in the United States. So true. Paul still, however, remains, or at least retains, some of that Clinton-era optimism, pointing at positive shifts that took place, particularly in terms of income inequality in the 1990s. He also rightly points out the rise of punitive and carceral policies under Clinton and other dimensions. But what I want to turn to just for the last couple of minutes here is to point out that while Paul is really attentive to the ways in which the changes that remade American politics come from both sides of the political aisle, there are ways in which I think the story could be amplified further in the 1990s in his discussion of the Clinton era. Paul spends a great deal of attention correctly on what is one of the most momentous shifts in American politics, largely accomplished by the political right, and that is the collapse of trade unionism, which has had devastating consequences for American politics and greatly exacerbated inequality. But he doesn't spend much time on one of the critical shifts that began happening in the Carter era, intensified in the Reagan era, and came in many respects to its fruition in the Clinton era, and that was the deregulation of credit and financial markets, which had devastating long-term consequences for the contradictions in the stories that he tells about the 21st century. The 21st century story, and Paul's telling is correctly about backlash against globalism, challenges to the shifting demographics that became apparent because of immigration. But it's also very much a story of the chickens coming home to roost with the deregulation of the economy that reached its crest in the 1990s, the product of a decades-long bipartisan effort. So I just wanted to put that on the table as maybe one thing I wish the book had emphasized more, although it's a mild criticism in a book that covers so much ground so brilliantly. Last question, and it's a very similar one to Maria's. We're thinking a lot the same way. This book is very American. It falls in many respects into the tradition of American exceptionalism, good and bad. And what I thought about as I finished reading the book is how much of the story is really a story of the United States and how much of it is a story of France or of Germany, countries that have very different political institutions and political histories, but have seen things like struggle over immigration, an upending of sex and gender roles, and a pushback against that, a decline in religious participation and a reorganization of the religious world. Or to throw one other example out, what about places that have seen the rise of Trumpist populists in the Americas. Brazil, for example, offers a really good case. Its history is complicated for sure, but we have seen a rise of populism in the context of also really profound, very US-like religious shifts, including the growing dominance of evangelicalism in a once predominantly Catholic country. How to, in other words, would this story be even richer, maybe in Paul's next book, if we put the American contradiction into a comparative context, thinking about the global contradictions that are remaking politics and everyday life globally. But again, buy this book.
So I may not remember all the questions that you've been asked. I'm going to start it in reverse order. So, Tom, you raised the question about how much of what has happened is just American, how much of it extends to other countries. And I did think about adding a chapter on exactly that question. And then I realized that's a whole other book, and it requires so much thinking and analysis that I'm just not going to attempt it. There are other books for other people who like, and they will address those questions. I'm just going to go in reverse order. You're exactly right. I don't pay enough attention to financial regulation. I have to admit here that my American Contradiction colleague, Bob Kuttner, read the manuscript, and that was actually his complaint as well. And I did stick in a few references, but I didn't make up for the fact that I didn't address that. There are a lot of other things which could have made the book 600 pages long, and then no one. I do appreciate the point you made about decentering the 1960s. So I don't generally talk about the 60s as a kind of general diffuse influence on American history. I don't really talk about the white new left at all. And I at one point, this is actually just a brief reference and as a footnote, I acknowledge there's a lot that I've left out. The things that were very important in their time, like the anti-war movement. So actually, I had the idea here that I was resisting emphasizing things that were part of my own experience. I was a student at Columbia in the late 1960s. I could have written about that. There's no mention of that in the book. I was involved in anti-war activities, and as important as I believe the anti-war movement and various other things that were going on in the left, as interesting as they were, important as they were at the moment, I don't actually believe they help us understand the world. So I made a deliberate decision. I'm not going to address it. I think the things which have had this long-run impact, first of all, the freedom struggle, and how it's influenced travel, how it's influenced travel to other groups, how it's influenced travel to the women's movement. So there are direct ways in which the black movement influenced the feminist movement, influenced the gay rights movement. So I'm trying to understand that as a sort of historical process that really challenge these traditional hierarchical relations in society. So this is what's connecting to this theme of the founding contradiction, the American contradiction that runs through our national life. And coming back to the things that Maria said, and I'm not going to remember all the questions that you raised because I wasn't writing them down until the end. But you raised the question of what was the fundamental cause of Trumpism, and because I do emphasize that somebody else could have been at the head of this movement. But I do think it actually mattered that it was Donald Trump. I think he is in many ways a singular figure. He has no inhibitions. He would say things that violated conventional norms about civil discourse, and I think that has worked very effectively because he was able to mobilize people who otherwise don't normally vote. And that's why I think a lot of the polls underestimated his support. These were just not people who traditionally showed up. But his shock tactics, I talk about Trump's language as a kind of shock tactic, broke through to these people who normally don't pay any attention to politics. So it worked in a way that really nobody, I think, really anticipated before. So he did matter, but I do think there was this underlying change that had already begun before, which was a shift of working class whites into the Republican Party, and the shift of college-educated whites toward Democrats that had already been happening before Trump. And I think, in a sense, the Republican Party was being repopulated by a group who now were going to be responsive to the kind of populist appeals that previously hadn't gone over the Republican Party. Just the old leadership hadn't registered that their party had kind of changed from below. You know, some of them had, but many others were still living in, you know, in the previous world. And so I think that's really crucial to understanding how this all happened. And then you also mentioned at the very end the question about Hispanic votes for Trump. So one thing that I emphasize is that the Hispanic vote is not like the black vote. The black vote has been overwhelming, steadfastly Democratic for a very long time. It doesn't vary that much from one election to the next. But George W. Bush did get 40 to 44% of the Hispanic vote in 2004. And there's just a lot of variation from election to election in the Hispanic vote for Republicans. And so I don't necessarily think that the increase in Trump's Hispanic vote is necessarily a sign of a long-term trend. But there is this question, how did this happen? And I think there are very strong gender differences in that vote. And that Trump's appeal to Hispanic men may have a lot to do with the cultures of origin of Hispanic immigrants. There are other things that I think may have influenced that vote in 2024. So the breakdown of the border under Biden, and really there was a border crisis under Biden, and the busing of from Texas in particular into the cities in the north and the Midwest and so forth. A lot of those people who came under the asylum provisions and under various temporary authorizations that Biden provided for nearly 1 million people coming in. A lot of those people ended up in cities and in neighborhoods where they were getting housing, and I think a lot of previous immigrants felt, hey, nobody did this for us before, and there's a lot of resentment that was created by it, and it ended up hurting Democrats. So you're doing the research in this area. You probably know a lot better than I do exactly what was going on in Hispanic communities. But you know, we see the reaction today. Recent polls indicate there's a considerable degree, I think, of buyer's remorse developing in Hispanic communities, given the crackdown that Trump is essentially.
All right, so we're going to open it up, and I'm guessing there's a bunch of questions, so it might take a few in a row. Raise your hand. Hillary, we'll start with you. I'm going to ask everyone, we have a mic. We you don't mind just kind of standing up so I can hear you a little better, that'd be great.
Given the themes of the book and the period you're examining, I really expected to hear something about a comparison between something that happened in the 50s and Trump, which is the McCarthy era. And you talked about aggression and fear. And there have been these comparisons in the media, so I was wondering if you could say about that.
We're going to pass the microphone back to the last row, please.
I actually had hi, I'm Lenny. I actually had a comment.
A little louder?
I actually had a comment, if it's okay. My comment is twofold. First, what amazes me most, almost about all these things that have gone down in the last year, is the stunning obviousness and right in front of our face of corruption that seems to be suddenly acceptable in our society. And I wonder where that fits in. And the other thing I want to say is, with regard to the Latino thing, my family is Cubans. They're Cubans. They always considered themselves white Cubans. They were Jewish Cubans. But in Spanish, because he couldn't speak English, my father would always say that Latinos have ruined this country. And he would say that in Spanish. And what I'm getting at here is there's a lot of racism within the Latino culture against brown Latinos and mixed Latinos. And I think that's some of what we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you. Let's just answer that first.
Well, okay, it's true that I don't spend a lot of time on McCarthyism in the book. It is, however, not because I think it's unimportant, and I have to mention this. So, my mother was very active in the 1950s in the anti-nuclear movement of that time. And she was even called to testify in Congress in a hearing about communist infiltration of that movement, the same nuclear committee. You remember that from those days, which she was very active in. And so I knew about the fear in my own family about when she was called to testify. But I sensed that was so limited by comparison to what is going on now. That was an episode that lasted for a relatively short period of time. It never had the full backing of President Eisenhower, and we had the media in the form of Edward R. Murrow and CBS and so on standing up against it. Today, we don't have the checks and balances for the Congress, for example. We think of the Senate McCarthy hearings. We don't have the institutional resistance, and we see in the media a lot of cowardice and acceptance. What's going on? So McCarthyism has some similarities today, but really, if I wish that was all we were facing. It's a much more dangerous moment now because there isn't that institutional opposition that we had back at that time. And on the question of anti-black racism in the Hispanic community, I think Maria might be able to speak to that better. So one thing that I think did mislead a lot of progressives is the idea that there was one harmonious group of people of color, and of course that's not true. Hispanics alone are extremely heterogeneous, and we now see so many cracks, and there have been for a long time, cracks in that general constituency. So I think there's a lot to do.
Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I would just add, as a fellow Cuban Americans have been voting Republican for a long time, so I think they're less part of the story of the recent shift. I think one of the things that's interesting, if you look at some of the survey data, is that across Hispanics of different skin tones, there was growing support for Trump. And so I don't think the kind of racism among the Hispanic community can tell the story of the shift, even if it can tell the story of kind of baseline level support for candidates.
Okay, so your hands here, and just wait for the microphone to get to you. As long as it's close to your mouth.
Okay, that's great. Of course, and by the way, I'm here representing your former classmate, Nick, who has to teach a class at Columbia Law School. So they were on the Columbia Daily Spectator together. So, a question about Donald Trump and how he rose to be president. Unlike, say, George Wallace, who did get a significant portion of the vote, he was enabled by mass media to be a national figure. I don't know if you address that in your book, and I don't know if there would have been anybody else who would have gathered the attention of the entire nation, because I can't think of anyone other than him who was part of this very popular media culture. So I don't know if your book talks about that, or whether, Trump is whether it would have happened without him. Secondly, I grew up in the trade union and civil rights movement, and I will say that the disaffection of trade union members and of trade union leaders, free trade had a lot to do with that. The opening of China had a lot to do with that. There has been a disconnect at times between leadership and the workers. I think that is seen today in the rise of Zoran in his mayoral race, because union leaders supported Cuomo, the members did not. So I do think that there are a number of complex factors. I'm hoping you address some of them in your book, because I no longer have the people in my family who were there at the time to remind me about that.
Let's, you raise your hands a little higher.
I've read a lot of you over the years. First, the United States, democracy requires time, energy, and money. Working class people have very little of all three. The U.S. Constitution was written by the worker, for the worker, and the reason it's so difficult to amend is that because they want to secure their position. The working class people already had an independence in the Jackson administration, where working class males were given a lot of vote. But that was never the original intention. I think it's a myth. It's in thinking ourselves as a democracy. And Jeffrey, the fact that we were Republicans was key. We're failing as a political policy. We don't have any social cohesion as emerged. We don't have a singular identity. Even use the word Hispanic. Cubans, Argentinians, and Brazilians, and Chileans consider themselves far superior to Bolivians, Ecuadorians, and all the others. And they don't like the word Hispanic because it lumps them all together. But we're in big trouble. We have no definition of what we are as a people. And we can't start thinking.
We're going to take one more question.
Thanks so much. This is a great panel. You mentioned that you didn't want to be conservative, but you also told us a little bit about how the right at some point disciplines itself. And so I'm wondering, positively looking into the future, what can our hope be for a Republican Party to what we get right now. Who should pin our votes? The conference will have tomorrow. But I'm right.
Anna, it's hard for me to imagine how we are going to be a stable democracy without a change within the group. I don't see any sign of that happening. I don't think there's any basis on what's going on now to anticipate it. But I don't know how we return to that stable system where there's rotation in office, where the party has power, has confidence that there'll be fair elections. I don't know how that happens unless the Republican Party comes back to an acceptance of democratic norms. So I think that is the way the most terrifying aspect of the present situation. That there isn't a sign within the Republican Party. Now maybe there are people who do want to return to that to the democracy we used to have, but right now they're not speaking up. And so I don't have a prescription of how to bring this about. It's really not a problem that that I could imagine addressing in any way myself, except by appealing to the traditions that Republicans used to honor. But that is, to me, the most disturbing aspect. That along with the Supreme Court's recent decisions authorizing almost unlimited executive power. That these together are just what happened? What happened to the old allegiances? To the conservatism that I used to disagree with, but really felt no antagonism to. And that's as good an answer as I can give to your question. And I don't know how to respond to what you said about our lacking any common, identity, American identity today. I think we get that identity partly through the leadership that we choose, and right now, Trump is putting Americans at war with each other. And when the people in the highest positions of power are setting Americans against each other, then it feels impossible that we will ever be able to regain the idea of a common identity of a single American community. But really, that is the alternative leadership that we need has to offer us that promise. And then, forgetting now, there was one other.
The mass media.
Oh, the mass media.
Someone really
Okay, there is actually a lot about the media in this book.
Oh, good. Then I'll read it.
So, I don't know if it
You don't
will
have to
address your question. It's not in one chapter. I come back to it in different points. The change that's taken place over this period is, of course, enormous, staggering, and I try to show how it connects with the other political and social changes going on to accentuate. I don't want to suggest it's the whole explanation for what happened. I didn't bring it up here, but it is absolutely an important fact.
Because we had Trump without his having been enabled by the apprentice. I mean, that's really a...
Yeah, but he also had turned out to be a master of social media,
Yes.
building his own support.
His
So
son-in-law.
he's a kind of transitional figure from that earlier, kind of mass media world into what we have today. I mean, he has benefited from both.
So we might be asking tomorrow how it is that a city that elects Eric Adams as mayor. Just a short time later, the election on as mayor. And we might find ourselves talking about we also might find ourselves talking about a whole other set of economic questions, which we discussed a little bit less today, which probably will be on everybody's minds for a long time to come. I want to ask you all to help me thank Paul and Tom and Maria. Know that I like to say at this point in the evening, we take real pride at IPK in making sure that all of our programming is free for everyone, except for NYU students who pay $90,000 a year. And all we ask for in return is that either you come and you show up with your spirited presence, which you did, and again, if you can help to make the booksellers be at home easier tonight, then I'll be grateful. I know that Paul's got a lot of friends and family and former colleagues here, and so I'm going to block all of you from him, usher him over to the book table, and you can meet him over there, and then we'll socialize a little bit afterwards. Thank you.